Welcome to the 92nd Theoretical Physics Colloquium by Professor Hans Thomas Janka from Max Planck Institute for Astrophysics in Garching, Germany. He received his PhD in 1991 from the Technical University of Munich. He had a postdoctoral position at the Max Planck Institute for Astrophysics between 91 and 94. Then he was a visiting scholar at the University of Chicago and Enrico Fermi Institute, supported by Otto Hahn Fellowship. He became a staff member at the Max Planck Institute for Astrophysics in 1995. He got habilitated at the Technical University of Munich in 2002, and he became a research group leader at the Max Planck Institute in 2009. Over the years, he received a number of different awards. In particular, he was receiving a Golden Chalk Award at Technical University of Munich several times. Henry and Ruth Rowing Prize for Scientific Publishing for the books Supernovae and Kosmische Gamma Rays. He is a project leader of multiple DEVGA-funded collaborative research centers. He is a member of the editorial board of Journal of Cosmology and Astroparticle Physics since 2003, and a member of advisory board of Popular Astronomy magazine Sterne and Weltraum, Stars and Space since 2013. His research interests include supernova theory, supernova physics, gamma ray bursts, neutrino astrophysics, neutron stars, numerical astrophysics, hydrodynamics, radiative transfer, many other things. And today he will be talking about core collapse supernovae, from neutrino-driven explosion models to observations. And with that, I'll give the microphone to Thomas.
Yeah, thank you very much for this kind invitation. I'm really happy to be with you and welcome everybody to this colloquium. As already said, the topic will be one of the core topics of the research done in my group here, core collapse supernovae. And over the past decade, we have started to connect three-dimensional, self-consistent ab initio neutrino-driven explosion models to observations. And I will give you a bit of an overview of the developments over the past decade in this area. This is a contents list of what I want to touch in my talk. I will begin with a basic introduction of the relevant physics, since I was advised to start my talk with a kind of a general background available or suitable for bringing students into this topic. Then in the second part, I will give you a status report of these ab initio 3D modeling of core collapse supernovae by the neutrino-driven mechanism. I will in particular stress an ingredient which we discovered to be important in the past 5 years only, namely that we need to go backward in time, actually before the stars collapse. We need three-dimensional initial conditions, which is not so easy to obtain. And therefore, we are also here limited in the inputs available to our simulations. And in the fourth point listed here, I will hopefully, towards the end of my talk, touch some observables, observational implications. There is a lot to be said, and there has been a lot of work in my group over the past 10 years in this area, and I cannot even touch a fair fraction of that. I will focus mostly on the supernova progenitor connection and the systematics with a few slides. And finally, I will briefly touch open questions and perspectives. As you all know, the number of supernova observations has dramatically grown with robotic searches and in particular the use of CCDs. Led to a lot of discoveries on the way, and here you see a plot with a number of supernovae observed over the years. And one of the particular developments over the past decade was that the number of what is called astrophysical or astronomical transients has grown enormously. And this is here on this slide. Apologize that this is in German, but you will be able to read most of that, I guess. So you have the core collapse supernovae, which we will concentrate on in this talk. You have the superluminous supernovae, which is a fraction of the core collapse events, but a very special and very rare phenomenon. You have the type 1a supernovae, special sub kind of those, type 1ax. Both of these types are connected to exploding white dwarfs, explosive mass ejection of white dwarfs interacting with a companion in a binary system. You have the gamma ray burst phenomenon, which is connected to hypernovae also in some cases. We have the kilonovae, which are those transient electromagnetic phenomena connected to neutron star mergers and neutron star black hole mergers, so far seen in very few cases only, and one very well observed one. Then we have some phenomena which are less luminous blue variables, which are maybe merger relics of stars and the classical novae. And you see that all these explosive phenomena are orders of magnitude brighter than the novae or the luminous blue variables. As said already, we will focus here on this class of core collapse events, which make 99.9% of all stellar massive star collapses and are connected to what we call this normal core collapse supernova phenomenon. Normal is very, it's a term which is not really well defined. It's a widespread of properties in even this class of phenomena, but I will not touch the superluminous ones or the hypernovae in my talk. This is a slide I mostly use for a general introduction because it shows the whole sequence of events which we will talk about in this colloquium. You have this massive progenitor star with what is called the onion shell structure, where we have these shells of nuclear material, ashes from previous burning stages. And at the center of this evolved star, shortly before it collapses, the iron core. And this iron core is enlarged in the lower left corner of this diagram. And it has the size of about our moon and the mass of maybe 1.5 solar masses. And it becomes unstable, gravitationally unstable, when microphysical processes like electron captures on protons, mostly bound in nuclei, set in, and the photodisintegration of iron core nuclei, of iron nuclei by the high temperatures here exceeding about 10 to the 10 Kelvin in this degenerate stellar core. The collapse happens within fractions of a second. It forms a neutron star. When nuclear matter density is reached, a shock wave is generated. This shock wave, in a way, by a physical process, which we will discuss in the forthcoming parts of my talk. Shock wave leads to a successful supernova explosion. And then what is left behind is this hot neutron star, radiating neutrinos, maybe continuously accreting more matter from the inner layers of the progenitor star, still falling towards the neutron star. And these neutrinos then cool the neutron star on a time scale of several seconds, so that it finally becomes this cold neutron-rich object, which we call a neutron star when it is transparent to neutrinos. So this is the sequence of events you should keep in mind. And what we will talk mostly about is what leads to the success of the explosion. And this was a puzzle which was keeping theorists busy for nearly 50 years, or even more than 50 years, maybe 35 years of modern supernova modeling, but the roots go back to the 1960s already with the first ideas that neutrinos could be involved in the way how the explosion starts. The reason for this suggestion by Colgate and White is relatively clear when you look at the energy budget. This newly formed neutron star releases the gravitational binding energy, which is converted into internal energy first and then radiated by these neutrinos, leaking out over a timescale of several seconds. And the energy is of this neutrino emission is several 10 to the 53 Earth, or several 10 to the 46 Joule. This is typically 100 times higher than the explosion energy of the supernova itself. So it's a huge energy reservoir which is carried away by neutrinos. and tapping only 1% of this huge energy reservoir is sufficient to explain the supernova explosion. This is, of course, also defining a numerical challenge because your simulations have to be able to treat the problem with an accuracy of the order of at least a few percent. It's not just 1%, it's a few percent, because what we are interested in is mostly electron neutrinos and antineutrinos. They are responsible for the energy transfer into the explosion, and they carry away about a third of this total energy. And of that energy, again, we need a few percent. We have one case of a supernova where these neutrinos coming from a collapsing iron core forming a neutron star have been measured. This is the same famous supernova 1987A. Here seen on this slide in terms of its progenitor, a blue supergiant star with its telephone number here. And here just after the explosion on 23rd of February 1987, the supernova brightening at the place where this blue supergiant had been located in the Large Magellanic Cloud in the Tarantula Nebula in that cloud. These neutrinos are summarized here on the slide. I borrowed from my colleague Georg Raffelt, who plotted these neutrino events in the Kamiokande detector in Japan, in the Irvine, Michigan, Brookhaven experiment in the United States, and here an experiment in the Caucasus Mountain Baksan laboratory. You see that in total these were 24 neutrinos, and their energies were typically of the order of 10 to 40 mega electron volts. And integrating the energy in this signal, one found an energy as had been predicted for the binding energy of a newborn neutron star, and also these energies of the individual neutrino events in this range between 10 and about 40 MeV had been predicted by a seminal work published only a year before Supernova 1987A by Burrows and Latimer, who had for the first time calculated this neutrino emission signal from a newborn neutron star in pretty much detail. With the supernova phenomenon, there's a long list of questions and also challenges which we want to address with simulations. On the one hand, we need to understand by first principle physics how the supernova explodes. What is the supernova explosion mechanism, the physical mechanism driving the explosion and providing the energy. Then, of course, we want to predict explosion properties of supernovae, asymmetries of these explosions as observed by astronomers, mixing phenomena which are diagnosed by light curve as well as spectral properties of the supernovae. And also we see asymmetries in the gas remnants left behind by those previous events, and we can observe about 200 of those gaseous remnants still in our galaxy. We want to understand neutron star and black hole formation paths and the probabilities of these different possibilities of compact remnants, because also these compact remnants now act as gravitational wave sources when they are in binaries. We want to predict neutron star and black hole properties, of course, the masses, kicks, spins, magnetic fields. Neutrino and gravitational wave signals are of relevance for the next galactic supernova, and we think we might have a good chance to not only measure the neutrinos, which are guaranteed with the experiments existing now, but also possibly gravitational waves from this galactic event. Supernovae are a splendid laboratory for non-standard physics beyond standard model physics, neutrino physics in particular. There is a revival of this possibility now, even still using supernova 1987A data, this only neutrino burst signal we have so far, and one can constrain quite a number of standard model beyond standard model suggestions by using this neutrino data, or other supernova properties actually, which we published recently in a paper where we showed that some supernova energetics can also be used to constrain beyond standard model physics. We have, of course, supernovae as the sites of nucleosynthesis, and it's of great importance for chemogalactic evolution questions, but also the still pending questions whether supernovae can produce R process elements, or at least a subset of supernovae might be an additional R process source in addition to neutron star mergers. And then finally, nuclear physicists are interested in the question of the equation of state in this ultra-dense hot neutron star matter. And hopefully a next galactic supernova with its neutrino and gravitational wave signal might also help us constraining suggestions for this high density matter physics in neutron stars. Let us go through a few slides which show you the sequence of events which can then be reproduced in detail by numerical calculations. Here on this slide, you again see this onion shell structure of the progenitor prior to collapse, with the iron core at the center, and then the overlying shells of these previous ashes of previous burning stages. And on top of all these shells, you have thin layers where nuclear burning is still going on, and still active silicon burning layer adds to a growing iron core mass. And we will zoom into this inner region to follow the further evolution. When this iron core reaches a mass close to the Chandrasekhar limit, it's not just the Chandrasekhar limit, because we talk about finite temperature effects here, and there's a lot of corrections or extensions to the zero temperature Chandrasekhar theory. And I said before, the onset of this instability, of this gravitational instability, is not just due to the Chandrasekhar limit. It comes from microphysics, electron capture, and nuclear photodisintegration, which sets in this iron core when this mass has grown to about 1.5 solar masses. And then this collapse proceeds up to nuclear matter density. A shock wave is formed at the moment of core bounce, where this inner highly compressed region bounces back and sends sound waves into the still infalling outer iron core layers, and these sound waves steepen into a shock, and this hydrodynamical shock travels outwards into the iron core against this infalling layer of iron. And this leads to a huge drain of energy, in particular by the disintegration, photodisintegration of iron material into free neutrons and protons. All the energy which is gained before by nuclear burning during the stellar evolution, several million years of evolution, is now again drained from this material in this photodisintegration process. And therefore, it was recognized pretty early, already in the 1970s and 1980s, with more and more detailed simulations, that the initial shock is unsuccessful. It doesn't reach the edge of the iron core. There has to be another process, a long time process, which leads to the revival of the shock wave, to the rejuvenation of the shock wave, and then a successful explosion in the long run. And this process was already suggested, as I mentioned before, by Colgate and White in the 1960s. And for the first time then seen in numerical simulations, in kind of modernish numerical simulations in the 1980s by Colgate, by Wilson and Jim Wilson in particular, and analyzed further by Hans Bethe and Jim Wilson in a seminal paper in 1985. These neutrinos leaking out from the neutron star, diffusing to the neutrino sphere, deposit a fraction of their energy, a few percent, in this post-shock material, mostly interacting with these free neutrons and protons, being absorbed on these neutrons and protons, and then depositing this energy can push the shock further out. And if this energy deposition is efficient enough, the shock can be revived in a delayed neutrino-driven mechanism and can initiate the explosion. If this happens, and here you see a case where we simulated this explosion in 3D, so this colorful inner part comes from a direct 3D simulation of this neutrino energy deposition process. If this is successful, the shock is pushed outwards through the oxygen layer, silicon layer, oxygen layer. The radioactive nickel is formed by the shock wave, behind the shock wave, or in this neutrino-driven material. Radioactive nickel, which then illuminates the supernova for months and years, is freshly produced in the explosion, and the shock wave is accelerating outwards through the overlying stellar layers and reaches the surface of the star on a time scale of hours up to several days, depending on whether the progenitor star was a compact star, a blue supergiant star, in which case it's only a few hours, or if it was a red supergiant star, in which case the shockwave may need even several days before it reaches the surface of the star. What is left behind at the center is this neutrino cooling neutron star, which radiates neutrinos in high luminosities for several seconds. In order to confirm this idea, which existed already for a long while and has been seen in some first simulations in the 1980s, we have to do self-consistent ab initio simulations. And what we have learned in tedious work and also some painful experiences over the past 3 decades is that we really need 3-dimensional simulations in order to get a final confirmation and a convincing numerical result. The reason for the 3-dimensionality of this problem is manifold. I will tell you later what is needed as inputs from the multidimensional side. But here this slide summarizes to you the components which numerical models have to take into account. There is a wide variety of physics, hydrodynamics or magnetohydrodynamics, even of the stellar plasma. We need relativistic gravity. We have to add this nuclear physics describing, on the one hand, the high density matter in the neutron stars, but also nuclear reactions which go on when material expands away from the neutron star. We have neutrino physics, a lot of neutrino reactions to be considered, neutrino transport, which has to be done with high sophistication because the phenomenon we are talking about is a neutrino-driven mechanism. So neutrinos have to be dealt and treated with high accuracy. And we learned that this is really a crucial ingredient in all this modeling. And finally, we need progenitor conditions. And here we refer to what is provided to us from stellar evolution modelers who evolve these stars from the moment of their creation, from their birth to the onset of core collapse. So we want to do the modeling, of course, not with artificially constructed initial conditions, but with conditions as computed in the stellar evolution calculations. And all these ingredients combined in a dynamical model then lead to the predictions of neutrinos, gravitational waves, explosion energies, and remnant masses, light curve, or electromagnetic emission, the spectra, nuclear synthesis, chemical elements formed in the explosion, and of course, explosion properties, explosion asymmetries, and consequences of those like the pulsar kicks, high energies, high velocities imparted on the newly born neutron stars because of the asymmetry of the explosion. There have been a huge, progress over the past 20 years, I would say. Since about 2000, the models have advanced in several steps. And we have learned that all these improvements have been relevant in order to understand the quantitative phenomena which proceed when the stars collapse and when the explosions are triggered by the neutrino-driven mechanism. So one of the first steps forward from the early modeling in the 1990s and maybe 1980s even, one of the first steps of improvement has been done with respect to the neutrino transport methods. Around the year 2000, several groups have started to use Boltzmann solvers or sophisticated two-moment closure methods with Eddington closure introduced for these two-moment schemes. Then we have also started to work on a more complete set of neutrino interactions, adding processes into the repository of neutrino interactions considered early on. In the 1980s, 1990s, it was mostly the beta processes here, electron captures and positron captures and the reverse reactions, neutrino scatterings of all particles. In the end of the 1990s, early 2000s, there was also the Nucleon-Bremsstrahlungs process recognized to be a very important process of neutrino, anti-neutrino pair production. And finally, we added also in our modeling the neutrino interactions, neutrino scatterings of other neutrinos, and also the pair conversions between neutrinos, which of course makes the codes more sophisticated and challenging because it couples neutrinos of different species. We also now use modern equation of states, and one of the main constraints on this side is that we need to obey several observational constraints. On the one hand, all modern equation of states used in supernova simulations should actually allow for neutron stars more massive than these limits here, the Antoniadis and Chromati and Domestinus neutron stars with a mass around 2 solar masses up to about 2.1 solar masses. We have now new limits from the gravitational wave measurements, limits on the neutron star radii here from the kilonovae and from the gravitational waves directly. And we have some recent observations, nicer observations of X-ray emission from neutron stars in binaries. And also these set some limits to the neutron star radii. And here my student Malte Heinlein has plotted a couple of equation of states which are used by many supernova groups, the still valid Latimer-Swazi equation of state, SFHO and SFHX from Hempel, Steiner and Fischer. And this is the DD2 equation of state, which is a pretty stiff one in this sample of equation of states plotted here. So that's one of the other constraints now fulfilled by modern models. We have all groups now use some treatment of general relativity, either direct treatment of relativity with the Einstein equations, or well-tested approximate methods to treat relativistic effects. We use modern progenitors and partly also have now started to use three-dimensional initial conditions. And one of the latest steps taken by the groups active in that field was the advanced modeling from 2 dimensions to finally 3 dimensions. This is pretty important because we recognize 2 major differences when you compare the 2-dimensional simulations or 2-dimensional setups with 3-dimensional conditions. The main difference here you see immediately is that this artificial symmetry here around the axis, which is assumed to be a symmetry axis in 2 dimensions, is gone in 3 dimensions. We have plumes and mushroom-like structures compared to these torus structures in 2 dimensions. And the other difference, which you don't recognize here, but you would see in power spectra, is that in 2 dimensions, the turbulent power cascade pumps energy from small scales into large scale structures, for which reason in 2 dimensions, you always get these big blooms as dominant features, while in 3 dimensions, the biggest structures fragment into smaller features. And this actually drains some energy from the biggest scales into smaller scales. And this can have some influence on the onset of the explosion. Before I continue to show you results of 3-dimensional modeling, let me go back to one slide, which I skipped twice because this mentions some new advances, which Robert Bollig in my group has been successful in implementing into our code. We now simulate in many of our models also the physics which is connected to the appearance of muons in the dense neutron star medium. Muons have a pretty high rest mass of about 105 mega-electron volts, and this rest mass was considered to prevent abundant formation of muons in neutron star media. But of course, the temperatures can well exceed 30 MeV, and electron chemical potentials can exceed 100 MeV in the neutron star core, for which reason there can be phases during the neutron star evolution where there is a pretty significant abundance of muons because of these temperatures and chemical potentials of electrons. And we even recognize that these muons appearing can soften the equation of state and can actually facilitate explosions in cases which are marginal or failing otherwise. So these muons, which can form through different reactions, here the long list of muon-neutrino interactions is shown, where neutrinos convert between different flavors, but also muons form from neutrino reactions. These reactions can then lead to the formation of muon abundance, which leads to a faster contraction of the neutron star and thus higher energetic emission of electron neutrinos and antineutrinos as well. So let me now continue with the 3-dimensional simulations I promised you to show in this talk. I show you first some very, very early successes which we had after some tedious work on advancing the 2-dimensional simulation to the 3rd dimension. And our first attempts in 3 dimensions were unsuccessful. But then in the year 2015, we had the first success cases. And we considered stars of different properties. And here, what is plotted on this slide is the density profile in the progenitor right before the star collapses versus a logarithm of the radius. And you can see, just looking at these density profiles, that you have a large variety of possibilities with, on the one hand, steep density profiles outside of this degenerate core. This is the interior high density region, which is here in this case an oxygen neon magnesium core. In the other cases, it's iron cores. And outside of this oxygen neon magnesium core, there is an enormously steep density gradient, whereas the iron cores have a much more shallow density decline. And the properties of the onset of the explosion, readiness to explode, or what we call the explodability of the progenitors, depends very, very sensitively on the steepness of the density profile. And let us first focus on those ones here in the lower part of the diagram, which have this low mass infall rates m dot, or the steep density profiles outside of the degenerate cores. And this was our first case where we saw an explosion by the neutrino-driven mechanism. And this was an oxygen neon magnesium core progenitor, so-called progenitor of an electron capture supernova, 9 solar mass star roughly, provided by Ken Nomoto. And we obtained an explosion here even in 1 dimension. So in spherical symmetry, you find that the core collapses, forms a neutron star here. So the radius of these mass shells shrinks. Here the mass shells contract to the newly formed neutron star. And here on the right hand, you see the time advancing, whereas the shock is propagating outwards all the time. And there is some infalling mass shells, which then follow the shock after a short delay. This pause is what is called the shock stagnation. And then neutrino heating actually pushes these shells outwards in a kind of neutrino-driven wind. In these low mass progenitors with a steep density decline, this explosion is pretty readily obtained and proceeds pretty quickly after core bounce. So on a time scale of about 50 to 100 milliseconds, the onset of the explosion is already taking place. It also leads to relatively low explosion energies, about 10 to the 50 ergs only, which is about 1/10 of the canonical value of these 10 to the 51 ergs I mentioned before. And of course, the question can be asked, are these explosions, do they reproduce some observations in nature? And I can tell you, I don't have time to talk about this in detail. We did quite some work on those. This is about the energy one observes in the Crab supernova. This Crab remnant of this supernova 1054 is diagnosed even with respect to its energy. And the estimate of the explosion energy of Crab was about 10 to the 49, 5 times 10 to the 49, up to 10 to the 50 ergs. So in the ballpark of this number. And also there is a little production of nickel and oxygen, carbon in these explosions. And also this seems to be compatible with Crab or low energy iron core collapse events. When you advance these simulations to multidimensionality, you see some convective instabilities, you see some asymmetries, but they are not really crucial for these explosions. They are a side effect and they make the explosion asymmetric to some extent, but they don't change the explosion mechanism fundamentally. Another case of such a low mass progenitor, which we exploded early on in 2015, we published an APJ letter with the first explosion result of this model, was a 9.6 solar mass progenitor. It was also plotted here. You saw the density profile on this slide here. It's actually here, this 9.6 solar mass case. It's this one here. Density profile is more shallow than in the oxygen neon magnesium core case, but it's still pretty steep. And also in this case, the explosion sets in pretty early, about 100 milliseconds after bounce. You see again the mass shells expanding when neutrino energy deposition drives these shells outwards. There is a quite significant asymmetry in this explosion. I show you now a movie of this three-dimensional simulation. The shock wave is here visible as a blue enveloping surface. And this orange ball is here an isoentropy surface, which gets corrugated very soon because of these convective instabilities. Now you see some convection setting in, perturbing this isoentropy surface. The neutron star actually was visible for a short while as a blue ball at the center. And the shock wave is pretty quickly accelerating. When you look at the bottom of this movie, you see the scale expanding. We are now at 3,000 kilometers in diameter. Shock is expanding very, very rapidly. And there are some relic asymmetries from the onset of the explosion in these ejecta of the explosion. But the explosion is really very, very fast. On a timescale of several hundred milliseconds, we reach a scale of about 6,000, 7,000 kilometers in diameter already. The explosion energy also in this low mass iron core explosion is pretty low. Again, this number of about 0.1 beta, 10 to the 50 erg only, about 1/10 of the typical energy of a core collapse supernova. And here you see this crab example, which I already mentioned as a case where this explosion may have been realized in nature. Now let's turn our attention to the cases which are harder to explode, the high mass infall, the cases with high mass infall rates. Actually, when you go to these very high mass infall rates, there may again be a regime where the explosion is easier, but there's an intermediate regime where the explosion is harder to obtain. And we actually had a struggle initially to explode a 20 or a 15 solar mass star. This was a case which we had simulated for a 20 solar mass model initially with our standard setup, neutrino physics, which I described to you, and it did not explode. But then we modified a small ingredient into this neutrino reaction, set of neutrino reactions. We actually changed the neutral current neutrino scattering by a strangeness contribution on the level of about 20%. So our strangeness contribution here in this axial vector coupling was about 0.2, less than 20%, actually about 15% of the coupling strength. And we reduced the neutral current neutrino nucleon scattering that way, and thus could convert an unsuccessful initial simulation of the 20 solar mass model into a successful one. And I show you the movie again here for this case. Same setup, shock will be visible as an enveloping blue surface, isoentropy surface here. And you will see that there is a large scale asymmetry developing initially, kind of even a kind of shaking mode, a sloshing mode, which deforms the entire post-shock region. And here we rotate this model in order for you to see this large scale asymmetry, which actually has a name. It's this so-called standard accretion shock instability. And then when the shock starts expanding, it converts in more a convective mode of asymmetry. And now we zoom outward because we see the onset of the explosion. The shock is running outwards. We have to follow here the shock evolution on a scale of more than 1,000 kilometers. And we see these post-shock plumes expanding and the asymmetry growing. The shock gets largely deformed in this 20 solar mass model, which has now developed a successful explosion. And finally, I show you an early case where we found an explosion for a 15 solar mass model, where we considered a rapidly rotating progenitor. This would lead to a formation of a 1 to 2 millisecond neutron star. And before I report about the details, I show you the movie of that. You will see the rotation of this 15 solar mass model by the rotation here in this on this isoentropy surface. Here you can see that it's pretty quickly rotating. There's also this large asymmetry mode, which we had seen before. Again, this standing accretion shock instability is developing, and the shock gets highly deformed and different from two-dimensional simulations of rapidly rotating progenitors. The explosion does not occur along the poles of the rotating model, but in the equatorial plane. So here is also a significant difference between two-dimensional and three-dimensional modeling. Rotating models, at least without magnetic fields, rotating models with a fast rotating mode explode towards the equatorial plane and not towards the poles. And you can see this shock evolution here compared to other cases I showed. Here is this 9.6 solar mass case. Here's the previous 20 solar mass model, which had this long delay before the explosion set in. And here's this 15 solar mass model, which you have seen in the movie, exploding with a significant degree of rotation. Okay, you have seen these two types of instabilities. This is a slide which is showing these convective instability asymmetry modes schematically here in this post-shock layer. This is the shock radius This is a neutron star. Here is the gain layer where neutrinos deposit their energy, and convection can stir this layer. But there can also be this Swazi instability, which leads to a large-scale asymmetry, either rotating or sloshing. And you can wonder whether these instabilities are actually a physical phenomenon or whether they are a numerical effect of our simulations. And actually, my friend and colleague Thierry Fogrizzo in Paris has been interested in this asymmetry over decades. And we analyzed this physics already in our 2D-dimensional models in the early years of after the millennium change. And here he has a setup which he started as a garden experiment, where he can actually see the basic physics of this instability in a laboratory experiment with water. This is called a Swazi experiment, shallow water asymmetry. And this has is a strong physical analogy to the Swazi instability in the supernova core. So water is fed in at the edge of this experiment pretty smoothly from all sides, then running downwards towards a central pipe on a curved surface, and is actually is swallowed by the central pipe. So the central pipe is here the accreting neutron star. The water here fed in at the edge of this tabletop experiment. This water is the infalling material from the stellar core falling towards the neutron star. And this height here, this jump in the water height, is an analogon of the shock, which you have seen in the movies as this blue enveloping surface. And when you feed in water with a very low rate, you see that this density or this discontinuity in the water height here remains nearly spherical. So it's a stalled shock with a spherical discontinuity in this case. When you increase the mass flow rate of the water, you see a sloshing mode developing, just similar to what you saw in some phases of the movies, which I showed you before. And finally, when you increase the mass flow rate even further, and this shock expands, this discontinuity expands further out, you see a spiral mode, as you have seen also in this movie, which we had with a rotating model. Here it's not coming from a rotational rotation existing in the water flow. It develops also in non-rotating models when the shock expands to a significant radius.
Thomas?
Sorry,
Yeah.
a question. Sorry.
Yeah, sure.
Go ahead.
In the numerical simulations, do you seed the instability in some way?
Yeah, I mean, I showed these movies, but I can again show you this movie with a 20 solar mass star, where you saw it very prominently, at least the sloshing mode. So you see the sloshing mode setting in first before the convection starts. Just a moment, here you see this sloshing instability. Yeah, this is the Swazi mode.
No,
and then there's a spiral phase for a very short moment. Yeah.
So I understand that there's the instability, but don't you, I mean, do you put in some slight perturbations?
Yeah, okay. No, we don't trigger the instability in the sense that we trigger the kind of instability in a certain manner. What we put into those simulations, of course, is a small amplitude, a small perturbation amplitude on the order of 1 per mil, so 0.1% of the density or the velocity. Our code actually, our code conserves spherical symmetry. If we start with a spherically symmetric initial condition, the code is written in a manner that it actually is accurate and precise enough to conserve spherical symmetry. So we have to perturb at least on a small level. Codes used by other groups, for example, may generate numerical noise in the simulations. For example, if you work with a Cartesian grid, the fact that a spherical flow moves across a Cartesian grid perturbs the flow naturally. And this is already sufficient to trigger such instabilities developing during the simulation.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thomas, another question.
Sure.
In that analog simulation, which is pretty amazing, there is obviously no refeeding of the matter. So basically, no sign of convective instabilities should be there, right?
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, that's what is actually pointed out here. That's one of the constraints. There is no convection. Actually, there has been recent setups which were follow-up work to what the original paper by Foglizzo in 2012 in Physical Review Letters showed. This is by a group at the Technical University in Munich, which actually investigated setups where they could mimic the effects of magnetic fields and viscosity in those flows. Because of this turbulence and the viscosity in the water, you can actually mimic some effects of magnetic fields, and they want to study the angular momentum transport in accretion disks now by such kinds of experiments. So there has been some advancement, and my colleague Thierry Foglizzo has also experimented a little bit with convective possibilities. So it depends on the water height, whether you can have some phenomenon, side phenomena, which could mimic some convective effects in this water flow. So there may be further applications if these experiments could be enlarged so that the water height can be increased. There may be some possibilities.
I see.
He has actually.
There is another question.
Yeah, sure.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Hi.
There is another.
Yeah, Henry de Young here. Really nice modeling, by the way. The pictures, the movies are excellent. One quick question: does the sloshing, would that, especially in a high mass star, would that generate detectable gravitational waves?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Actually, in some of my talks, I have time to discuss this. Yes, this mode is particularly strong in massive progenitors where the shock is actually receding for a while. This 20 solar mass case showed some phase of shock recession, which helps these modes to grow. I had this one slide where you saw this. Yeah, this slide actually, where the 20 solar mass case, look at this curve here. When the shock recedes, you have these phases of instabilities, these sloshing phases and spiral phases very strongly and prominently. And we have some models where black holes form, and there you have this mode very, very strongly, and the mass inflow rate is very high. And this produces gravitational waves with a very, very characteristic modulation frequency of the order of about 100 Hertz. So you see a prominent mode of gravitational wave emission with a frequency of 100 Hertz. And we have the same modulation frequency in the neutrino signal. So this will be measurable signals in the case of a galactic core collapse event. Yeah.
Thank you. That's great.
Yeah. Okay, let us now come to a final ingredient, which is very, very relevant when we ask the question of robustness of these explosions by the neutrino-driven mechanism in 3D. And this is an ingredient which actually causes a headache for us, because it forced us to go back in time. Namely, we had to recognize that some of these explosions, which we obtained in the cases I showed you before, depend very sensitively on the initial conditions chosen, either the imposed rotation on the progenitor or the neutrino physics, which we modified to a small extent only, but at least we had to modify the neutrino physics compared to our initial setup, which was the best one, guided by the developments on the side of the neutrino physics and nuclear physics. So we had to recognize that what is very, very relevant in all these simulations are initial asymmetries which exist in the progenitor stars even prior to the onset of collapse. And I show you only one example here that has been a development over some, let me say, 7 or 8 years. Initially, there has been suggestions in this direction by Dave Arnett and colleagues over 2 decades even. Dave Arnett pointed this problem out to us already in the 1990s when he simulated the convective burning phases of progenitors prior to core collapse, oxygen burning and silicon burning in 2 dimensions, and he saw these asymmetries developing. He did some follow-up work in the late 1990s then, and in the decade following afterwards by Meakin et al. There have been repeated claims by Dave Arnett that this pre-collapse asymmetries may be of relevance. And then finally pointing this out in core collapse context was Sean Couch and Christian Ott, and around the same time Bernhard Müller and myself, where we simulated 2-dimensional conditions in the progenitor stars, large-scale perturbations in the progenitor stars, and saw that they had an influence on the explosion. And here I show you a simulation which was done by Bernhard Müller and Naveen Yadav. Here, Naveen in my group, and Bernhard is at Monash in Australia now, in Melbourne. And they simulated actually the pre-collapse evolution of a 19 solar mass progenitor star over 7 minutes before the star collapses. And let me just show you a movie of this simulation. So what you see in this movie, you see an iso surface of a constant mass fraction of silicon in the oxygen burning shell. So we zoom into the oxygen burning shell of this progenitor. And this is an iso surface of silicon, which is a product of oxygen burning. And on top of this surface, color-coded, you see the velocity. Red means inward moving flow, yeah, negative velocities. Blue means outward moving flow. And initially, we have to start with a spherically symmetric setup because spherical models are provided to us from stellar evolution modelers. And what we see developing in this three-dimensional simulation now, over a timescale of several minutes, again, here, look at the upper right corner. This is the time up to collapse, minus 255 seconds. So about 5 minutes before the collapse sets in, on a scale of about 25,000 kilometers. So in the oxygen burning shell. And you see that these asymmetries grow larger and larger in velocity, amplitude, but also in the scale here in the three-dimensional space. You see that there are large-scale asymmetries prior to the collapse, even in the progenitor. And this actually even is growing to a larger scale here in this progenitor because there was an unburned neon layer, which was encompassed in the oxygen burning shell. And then this neon ignited and led to this huge asymmetry in the pre-collapse conditions in the oxygen shell of this 19 solar mass star. And this was the initial condition, which was then used at the onset of collapse to continue through core collapse into the explosion. And before I discuss the slide here, let me show you a movie. This movie is a cross-sectional movie through the three-dimensional simulation, showing on the left-hand side the three-dimensional simulation for the three-dimensional progenitor. So here you see the perturbations in the oxygen shell. At the center, the newly formed neutron star, and here on the right hand, the standard setup from a spherically symmetric progenitor as provided to us by the stellar evolution modelers. And what you see is that the simulation on the left-hand side with a three-dimensional progenitor ends up in an explosion, while the simulation on the right-hand side fails in leading to an explosion. And this was the general outcome of all of our simulations with this 19 solar mass progenitor. Whenever we used spherically symmetric initial conditions, whatever we used as an input physics, the models failed to explode, whereas the models which we ran with the three-dimensional initial conditions, independent of the neutrino physics, which we vary to some extent with and without muons, but also independent of the equation of state, we use different nuclear equations of state. All of them finally led to successful explosions. So the three-dimensional progenitor conditions are a crucial input into the modeling of the explosion when we want to have a robustness of the neutrino-driven mechanism. What we did also in this simulation by Robert Bollig was that we continued the simulation into a phase where the explosion energy finally for this 20 solar mass or 19 solar mass model could be determined. And this takes several seconds. Here in the lower left corner, you see the explosion energy as a function of time. And you can see that this explosion energy grows over this whole period of the simulation, which lasts for several seconds after core bounce. Most of the three-dimensional simulations, however, are stopped even before 1 second because of the enormous computational efforts which are needed to run these three-dimensional models. And we could achieve this three-dimensional simulation for several seconds, for actually 7 seconds here, only because we had a very long code development here on the with respect to the increasing the efficiency of our three-dimensional simulation. So we run with full three-dimensional physics, full neutrino transport up to about 2 seconds. And then we have some ongoing neutrino treatment, which we tested and which is good enough to follow the neutrino effects over a long time scale. Here you see the neutrino emission, different neutrino species for mean energies actually plotted here with the dashed lines and neutrino luminosities for this whole evolution. And after these 7 seconds, the neutron star is already approaching this final phase where we are close to neutrino transparency in the neutron star. So this simulation running for several seconds into the explosion, fully self-consistent, leads to this condition after 7 seconds, 7 seconds after bounce, 6.7 seconds into the explosion. And you see that it's highly asymmetric, and it will lead to a large asymmetry of the explosion in the long run. And my student, Daniel Kresse, is now following it for the late time evolution. Let me summarize now towards the end of my talk what has been achieved in the community. So I gave you some examples of what we did here in Garching and what we did now more recently also in collaboration with Bernhard Müller at Monash in Australia. Gave you this example of a 9.6, of a 15 and a 19 solar mass star. We did more models. We have a set of 3-dimensional simulations now. Bernhard at Monash continued with other progenitors, in particular non-rotating models for binary progenitors, which are stripped of their hydrogen and partially helium envelopes. And so he could see 3-dimensional simulations in these simulations, in these progenitor cases as well. Most of them calculated or simulated with 3-dimensional initial conditions. And him, as well as us here in Garching, also investigated black hole formation cases. There has been some early work by the Oak Ridge group. 15 solar mass successful explosion model was already announced in 2015. I think they did some more recent work on low mass progenitors as well. Tokyo and Fukuoka have published a number of cases with successful 3-dimensional models, an early case for an 11.2 solar mass model. More recently, they have mostly considered rapidly rotating progenitors and also magnetorotational models with magnetic fields. There was some early results published in 2 papers in 2016 and 2018 by Luc Roberts and Christian Ott, of a small set of progenitors where they found most of the cases found neutrino-driven explosions in 3 dimensions. And also more recently, there has been quite some extended work by the Princeton group, Adam Burrows and collaborators, which have a large set of progenitor models between 9 and 40 solar masses, and with a few exceptions, only around 15 solar masses, they found explosions in 3 dimensions. However, I must stress that many of the modeling inputs by the different groups are different, not only in details, but in major ingredients used in the simulations, neutrino transport methods, also the detailedness of the treatment of neutrino reactions. The resolution chosen in these different simulations is largely different in some cases. Adam and his group were able to run a large set of progenitor models by choosing a relatively coarse radial resolution. The angular grid is relatively good, not so good in the neutron star itself, but around the neutron star it's pretty good. But the radial resolution is much coarser than in our models, and this can have potential effects on the neutrino emission properties. But what is needed actually in order to find all these caveats in these results is detailed model comparisons in 3D, which are missing so far, are desirable, but they would be quite a challenge to be done. It would be a community effort with a significant investment of time and computer resources. Yeah, let me skip these slides here, which explain a bit more the details of the neutrino-driven mechanism, and jump to my summary slide. At this stage, at least, I want to provide you a summary. I have a few more slides on observational aspects, which I may flash or may not flash. It's up to your choice. I'm also ready to answer questions. I think I've used up most of my time already. It's an hour now. Summary is that the 3-dimensional modeling has reached a mature stage. We now have several groups active in that area. It's still time consuming, and we have to write computer time grants for doing this. So it will not probably lead to mass production soon. It's still a big effort, but at least we will make continuous progress in the 3-dimensional modeling. 3-dimensional simulations differ in a lot of aspects compared to 2-dimensional modelings. In particular, what was actually shown on this slide here three-dimensional simulations, in particular, this is a convective Mach number in the post-shock flow, three-dimensional models are less prone to explosions than two dimensions. So there have been some groups with mass-producing results in two dimensions, many progenitors run in 2D. But I give you a warning here, two-dimensional simulations lead to explosions more readily than three-dimensional simulations. There are neutrino-driven explosions now for quite a suite of progenitors between 9 and 40 solar masses. And most recent simulations run for several seconds also show that you can obtain healthy neutrino-driven explosions with the typical canonical 10 to the 51 erg of explosion energy. One of the caveats and problems for the work we are doing is that all of the progenitors models, and there are more and more produced now with the MESA code being available to a large number of groups using this tool for producing 1D progenitor models. All of these data are provided in one dimension, so in spherical symmetry. But as I have tried to convince you, the three-dimensional perturbations in those progenitors are crucial for obtaining robust explosions in 3 dimensions. And finally, of course, we are always fighting resolution issues. I mentioned a couple of them when I talked about the work done by the different groups in the field. Now, versus observations, of course, that is one thing I mentioned in my abstract. Of course, there is a large number of observables which one would have to discuss. I don't have any time in such an overview talk. I had a question already on the gravitational wave signals, neutrino signals. There is slides I would have for these issues which are of interest for next galactic supernova. There is an interesting side effect of the explosion. Neutron stars are kicked to velocities by these three-dimensional instabilities. We actually have seen neutron star kicks up to more than 1,000 kilometers a second. So I think we can explain all observationally measured neutron star velocities by the three-dimensional asymmetries developing in these explosions. We have asymmetric mass ejection and large-scale radial mixing in these long-time evolution. In this long-time evolution of the explosion, we have also compared these mixing phenomena with light curves and spectral phenomena observed by the astronomers, and we find that neutrino-driven explosions can provide healthy explosions for these healthy explanations for these phenomena. In the past decade, I worked a lot with an ESC grant on a comparison of our simulations, three-dimensional simulations with GRAB, Cassiopeia A, and Supernova 87A. And finally, what is of great interest for many people working on a systematic connection between progenitors, the supernova explosion properties, and the remnants is that we now extended the modeling systematically by a good knowledge of what the neutrino-driven mechanism can do into one-dimensional modeling with neutrino-driven engines. And now we can really do systematics here. I have a few slides. I don't go into the details now. We can find correlations of certain explosion properties here, the nickel mass and the explosion energy. That is what my group has here predicted, Thomas Ertl in his simulations. Zuckbold et al. We collaborated with Stan Woosley and Tak Zuckbold using their progenitor models. So you predict correlations of the nickel mass produced in the explosions and the explosion energy. That is work here by Tomek Pecha and Andre Pecha and Todd Thompson, which have also an engine way of simulating neutrino-driven explosions based on the knowledge we gained by the three-dimensional modeling over the past decade. And here you see what is actually observed. You see this kind of correlation of the nickel mass of the supernovae and the explosion energy also in the observational data here by different groups. This is work by Andre Pecha and collaborators. This is work by Hamui, early work already by Hamui. This is work by the Italian group Pumo, and this is by Eldridge. So you can see this correlation data in the observations, and we see these in neutrino-driven explosions as well, for a fundamental physical reason, which I could explain. So that much, I really have used plenty of time now, that much for observations. There is, of course, a lot more to say. This long list I flashed before, I want to keep it on the slide now and receive questions. Thank you very much for your attention. I've really used your patience very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much for such a nice presentation. It was really mesmerizing to watch those simulations. So let's take some questions now. Mark Alford, I think you were the first.
Yeah, so thank you. Yes, that was really great and illuminating. And my question was about you mentioned some per mil level artificial asymmetries that you put in earlier on, and then you talked about asymmetries from the progenitor. And I just wondered if you could clarify the relationship, like if you have the progenitor ones, do you not need the artificial ones? And is the per mil scale chosen for some reason, like it's similar to what the progenitor gives?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. What is the relevance of these progenitor asymmetries? Well, the relevance is actually, that's visible on one of the slides, which I skipped. Well, this is the critical condition for the explosion. There was an early suggestion that there is a connection of the luminosity and spectral properties of the neutrinos emitted from the neutron star. This is what enters the heating rate by neutrinos. And the critical condition relates this quantity here, this explosion relevant neutrino quantity with the mass inflow rate and the mass. And what we discovered over the past decade is that there is a second factor entering here, which actually depends on the turbulence in the post-shock layer. And here, in this factor here, the relevance of these progenitor asymmetries enters. What these progenitor asymmetries are doing is they stir the asymmetries in these asymmetries in the progenitor. They stir these asymmetries in the post-shock layer. That means when we start with our simulations with a very small initial perturbation of 0.1% in velocity or in density, we have a very, very small seed of this post-shock turbulence, of this post-shock asymmetry. And when we start with a progenitor asymmetry, with a large-scale asymmetry in the progenitor, the growth of these post-shock perturbations is much faster, and the amplitude of this post-shock perturbation is also growing to a higher value. And this actually helps the shock revival through this relation, which you see here, namely through this factor, which increases or decreases the right-hand side. So it decreases the right-hand side and decreases the critical threshold luminosity and spectral properties you need for the neutrino heating to get a successful explosion. It's a stirring effect to the post-shock perturbations, which comes from the pre-existing progenitor asymmetries. Does this answer your question?
You're muted.
Yeah, partly, but I was wondering that per mil thing you mentioned.
Yeah.
Why 1 in 1,000? Why not 1 in 1,000,000? Or...
Okay. Yeah. Good. Okay. Yeah, I can tell you why. I can tell you why. It was a historical choice which we did in the early 1990s when we started with the first multidimensional simulations. And at that time, very little was known about the perturbations existing in progenitor stars. And we wanted to do it in a most conservative manner. That means we wanted not to start out a simulation with a large amplitude of perturbation because we thought we would predetermine the outcome. And at that time, there was a strong belief that neutrino-driven explosions should be as much independent of pre-existing asymmetries, as much independent as possible, using as little assumptions to be put into those simulations. Other groups started at that time already with somewhat larger perturbations. Adam Boros had a very early letter in Physical Review at the end of the 1990s, where he actually followed a recipe or a suggestion by Dave Arnett using a larger scale perturbation. But we wanted to be conservative, and we heard at that time always the criticism, if we put in large scale perturbations, we predetermine the result and we make it dependent on initial assumptions, which would be undesirable. And that's also the reason why most recently we don't use perturbations put in with large amplitude by hand, but we go back in time modeling the progenitor development, the progenitor evolution already prior to collapse, because we want to be as self-consistent in our modeling as possible.
Okay, thank you. The next question.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Next question is Alexei Ivanitsky.
Hello, thanks a lot for the talk. And I'm curious, what the maximal mass of the neutron star remnant, which can be reached with this neutrino-driven mechanism, if we are taking purely hadronic equation of state?
Yes, yeah, okay. This is actually on slides like those, where you see the gravitational mass of the neutron star plotted as a function of a progenitor. And what you see here, well, could be plotted as a distribution. I would have other slides showing this as a mass distribution. What we find in experiments like those, one-dimensional simulations, of course, encoding the essence of the neutrino-driven mechanism, is that the maximum mass for the progenitors provided to us is of the order of about 2 solar masses. We find some remnants which are between 2 and 3 solar masses, which could be black holes or neutron stars, depending on the equation of state, of course. Depends very much where the equation of state limit is for the maximum neutron star mass. And then above these 2.5 to 3 solar masses, we find a lot of remnants with black hole masses. Of course, it depends on the progenitor set which we are using. Here we have a solar metallicity progenitor set where the maximum mass is of the order of 1.9 solar masses. And it's about here, I think this is the gravitational mass. So the gravitational mass comes down to 1.7 solar masses if the baryonic mass is 1.9. We have a few higher mass cases if we go to strip progenitors or lower metallicity progenitors.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I don't see a raised hand at the moment, so I had a question of my own. Yeah. You had this sort of only in the summary and you didn't expand much, but I was wondering about the pulsar kicks. What do you think is sort of the maximum pulsar kick velocity you could achieve through this asymmetric explosions?
Yeah, I show you a slide which I had prepared, but here it is. It was not to be shown, it was in the backup. Yeah, here you have what is the crucial inputs in this pulsar kick. I actually have a paper out in 2017 in APJ where I did the analytics of this mechanism. So it's these asymmetries which in the end, because of the asymmetric ejection of material, lead to the recoil velocity of the neutron star. And what enters this recoil velocity here in this analytic formula is an asymmetry parameter. So this measures the relative asymmetry of the mass distribution around the neutron star. Here it was assumed to be a 10% perturbation on top of the monopole. So the dipole asymmetry here is 10%. And what it also depends on is the explosion energy. So using this 10% asymmetry and an explosion energy of about 10 to the 51 ergs, this fudge factor here is of order unity. So forget about it. It's not relevant. It's always of order unity. I have shown this in this paper. Here you find a velocity of about 200 kilometers per second. Now, if you increase the explosion energy to what may be the maximum explosion energy we think is possible by the neutrino-driven mechanism, maybe 3 times 10 to the 51 ergs, so 3 times this value. And this asymmetry parameter from many 3-dimensional models, which we have done, about 60 or so 3-dimensional models, which my postdoc and previous student Anna Wongmatanarat has simulated, we find that this asymmetry parameter can be at most about 0.5. So 0.5, so factor of 5 here, factor of 3 here. So you have about a factor of something like 10 of this value. So up to maybe 2000 kilometers per second. That's roughly the number I would give you, which I think we can explain with a neutrino-driven mechanism. Yeah.
I see. The 2000 seem to be a lot, so it probably will explain majority, if not all of them.
Yeah,
right.
I must mention that there is a side effect also added by the neutrinos. Also, neutrino emission from the neutron star is asymmetric. We have seen that in 3-dimensional modeling of the neutrino cooling phase of the neutron star. We have seen that there is an asymmetry, a dipole asymmetry mode, but the neutrino emission asymmetry remains, with respect to the kick effects, remains relatively minor compared to the hydrodynamic kick. So it may change this number only on a level of about 10%.
I see. Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, next question is Cecilia Lunardini. Please go ahead.
Yes, I was curious about these simulations that you showed for the progenitor evolution for the last, say, 5 minutes before the collapse. I was curious if there is a neutrino emissivity calculated for those 5 minutes pre-collapse.
No, it's a pure hydrodynamical simulation with a small nuclear network, but there is no neutrino emission for this period of time. Actually, I don't think that there will be a significant difference compared to the one-dimensional modeling, except for the neutrinos, which come maybe as a side effect of nuclear reactions. There is a kind of a boost of the nuclear burning, but I'm not sure that this adds neutrino emission at any significant level. As you know, that most of these neutrinos coming from this phase are pair neutrinos from the pair cooling. And these neutrinos, I don't think that they are affected by the multidimensionality of these late stages of convective burning.
But for example, the beta processes might be affected, you're saying?
Yeah, they might actually in the very, very late stage. Just right before the collapse sets in, the last few seconds before the collapse happens, you have a significant boost in the convective burning, but we have not included this in the simulations. I cannot tell you any numerical results.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Okay, next question. Nashad Khosravi Largani. Hope I pronounced that correctly.
Yes, thank you. I hope you can hear me. Thank you for your interesting talk. My question is again related to the gravitational waves. I wanted to know if there are any special oscillation modes excited due to the progenitor asymmetries in this case.
Again, gravitational waves, you said, or G modes?
Yes, oscillation modes. Like if there is any special mode that would be excited because of this assumption.
Yeah, so in the progenitor, you mean, in the progenitor
burning?
Yeah, of course. I mean, this convective burning will instigate gravity modes in the progenitor, which might actually travel for some distance. We follow those in the simulations. Yes, the convective burning, as you can already guess, is very strong, and it leads to large buoyancy instability. Yes, there is certainly a relevance, and maybe if that happens earlier during the evolution, for example, this fusion of the neon shell with the convective oxygen burning shell, that might indeed stir the gravity mode instabilities, which may have some relevance. Yeah. And there have been suggestions, as you might know, there have been suggestions that this might lead to mass ejection prior to the collapse. But I think for the observed mass ejection phenomena, these effects have to occur much, much earlier than we simulated. I mean, we just simulated a few minutes, and these waves have no chance to travel out through the progenitor before the explosion sets in.
I see. So there might be a chance that you can see these modes in the range that will be detectable in a galactic detection, maybe.
Of what? Galactic detection of what?
Gravitational waves, of course.
Gravitational wave emission. Yeah, that's a good question. That's a good question. But again, here we are not able to give you a quantitative answer. What is really interesting, what would be interesting to do is to analyze our three-dimensional simulations, which have been started with the three-dimensional progenitor conditions, to analyze them for gravitational waves and to compare the gravitational wave signal to a simulation which has been done in spherical, which started with a progenitor in spherical symmetry. But the problem is that at the moment we don't write outputs in sufficiently high cadency in order to do a reliable analysis of this signal. We will certainly address this issue in future simulations, but I cannot give you any quantitative clue at the moment on the relevance of these pre-existing progenitor asymmetries on the gravitational wave emission. Bernhard Müller, actually at Monash, might do some work in this direction. The group is very active in the direction of gravitational wave diagnostics, because they have some funding from the Australian government for this science. Maybe Bernhard has used some of their recent simulations to analyze the gravitational wave signal independence on the pre-existing progenitor perturbations.
This is very interesting. Thank you very much for your answer.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I don't see any raised hands. So I actually have another question of my own. So I wanted to ask, in terms of this field, supernova explosions, which experimental data, observational data, you are thinking most promising, most useful to constrain or verify the simulations or help the simulations?
Yeah, that's a very, very important question. And actually, I have a second talk on exactly this issue, showing you a lot of the work which we had done, in particular connecting here the list of issues. Yeah, and what is particularly relevant, of course, is this progenitor explosion and remnant systematics, and also maybe the properties of young supernova remnants, which still carry significant imprints from the moment of the explosion. Of course, supernovae are observed now regularly, and many of them per year, but most of them are extremely far away. So we just have a few data points on the light curve. In many cases, we don't even have spectra. We don't have any time evolution in spectra. And all these cases, which are observed in a large number, are of course not of very much use for diagnosing supernova properties. So the main information we can currently obtain are from these nearby supernova remnants and also systematics. And I showed you this slide before, so you have to go back this direction. I showed you this slide before. That is particularly interesting, or these correlations, these kind of observational correlations. And you see that there are significant error bars still. We need more data of supernovae in this range here of explosion energies and nickel masses. We need a better analysis of these data. And in particular, what is one of the remaining questions is how this regime of the ordinary supernovae transitions into the hypernova branch. When you look at here, the nickel masses and the explosion energies, there is this standard supernova type, which has an explosion energy of less than about 3 beta or so, 3 times 10 to the 51 ergs, and a nickel mass of maybe less than 0.2 solar masses. And then there is a highly energetic branch with a lot of nickel being produced in the explosion. And we currently don't understand how the transition from the ordinary supernovae into this high energy explosion happens. So we need more diagnostic data of that sort, and we need better individual observations of remnants and maybe nearby supernovae observed in high time frequency, so that we can really see evolution of spectra, mixing asymmetries, polarization data, so that we can see asymmetries in the inner ejecta, in this material which comes from the core of the supernova, and which diagnoses where we can diagnose the asymmetries imprinted by the explosion mechanism. So these are the data we would seek for. Of course, I mean, a galactic supernova with a neutrino and gravitational wave signal would be splendid, but I've been waiting for such a case for 35 years now. After 87A, we had a huge attempt to get neutrino facilities working over long periods of time, and we are still very, very, yeah, I would say, we are left with our hope at the moment for a galactic event. The gravitational wave community has data and now has harvests a lot of inflow of newly measured signals, but in the neutrino community, we have not been that lucky after 87A, unfortunately.
Right. Yeah. Okay. I don't see any other raised hands, so I think I want to use this opportunity to thank you again for a very nice presentation and staying around answering all the questions. Thanks on behalf of everybody.